But me, like in my brain, I thought, well, the Bible is literal, right? And the Bible never mentions dinosaurs, so dinosaurs aren't real. So I would have conversations with my friends and like in like grade school about arguing with them why dinosaurs can't be real because they're not in the Bible.
The proceeds of this monetized episode are going towards I Am Dying Out Loud. Find out more in the description. Well, Dean and Dean's cat, I did not get an introduction.
This is Dahlia. Yeah, she's behind me.
Hi,
My other
Dahlia.
cat is on the other side of the couch. We'll see if he shows up.
Great.
His name is George.
Dean, nice. So we have Dean, Dahlia, and George.
Yes. Yeah.
Perfect. Well, the trio, Dean, Dahlia, and George, thank you so much for joining me on Growing Up Fundie. I really appreciate you sharing your time and your story and your wisdom with us. I say us, it's just me, but us can be the listeners too. I always say us when I'm talking about Growing Up Fundie, but it's just me. I'm the only one behind it. And one thing that I found super interesting about your story when you gave me more details was one, you mentioned that you grew up non-denominational, but so much of the details involved in your upbringing was very like fundamentalist Christianity. And it's always interesting to me when I meet people who very much grew up fundamentalist, but their family and their church still insisted they were non-denominational. It's almost like if they don't use the term fundamentalist, it doesn't count or something like that. I feel like that's a newer thing that happens a lot. And so I thought that was super interesting because you gave some details that I'll let you tell in your story later. And then also I thought your deconstruction story was super duper interesting. And I thought like a lot of people would listen to it and either hear themselves in it or kind of understand based on how you figured your future out. Maybe that might help them, but enough for me. I'd love to hear about you. Tell me about yourself.
Yeah, so my name is Dean. Like I said, I grew up in non-denominational churches, like you said. Two of them, really, because I grew up in Central Oregon, moved out of state partway through high school year. The first church I went to was just like you said, non-denominational. I mean, they both were, but the second one, I'll get to this, but the second one did use the term fundamentalist.
Interesting.
Yeah. So the first church did not. The first church was very, it was not about branding, right? The only branding thing they did is it was like a cowboy church because it was in the middle of Central Oregon and rural. It wasn't even in any of the cities. It was like in this little small farming community outside of town. But, I was taught growing up that the earth is 6,000 years old, that dinosaurs and humans coexisted because the animals were created on the fourth day or something and humans on the sixth or whatever. But me, like in my brain, I thought, well, the Bible is literal, right? And the Bible never mentions dinosaurs, so dinosaurs aren't real. So I would have conversations with my friends and like in like grade school about arguing with them why dinosaurs can't be real because they're not in the Bible, things like that.
Right.
It was that kind of level of literalism. So the one thing it wasn't legalistic, which I suppose you're probably familiar with that term. It was like, you could drink, if you're old enough, you could drink alcohol, but you're not supposed to get drunk. You could dance and like play card games and stuff like that, right? Whereas, some members of my family grew up in churches and households where no alcohol, you can't even drink, or you can't even play card games because you might accidentally end up gambling. So in many ways, I do consider myself lucky that it wasn't as strict as it could have been.
100%, yeah.
And the other thing, of course, was hell and this idea of eternal conscious torment after death for unbelievers. And it was in that church where at one point I decided, no, that is illogical. That can't be. I remember I was in youth group. I remember this. I was sitting in youth group and our youth pastor was talking about hell and eternal conscious torment. And I didn't say anything out loud, but in my mind, that was what I said. I just said, nah. And that was the beginning of the end for me. And it was years later that would be actually the end, you know what I mean? But that led me down that path of deconstruction, like you said. That was the first moment. And then I moved out of state, like I said, went to another church, and this other church was non-denominational. And it gets confusing with organizational structures and all this.
Totally. Yeah.
It's part of that church is not part of a denomination because there's no organizational structure above the church itself. You know what I mean? It's more like a confederation of churches, and it's called the Independent Fundamental Churches of America, the IFCA.
Mm-hmm.
And so the church doesn't necessarily brand itself as a fundamentalist church, but new members are told that it's part of the Independent Fundamental Churches of America.
Interesting.
So, as far as beliefs go, very similar to the church I grew up in, except that this church has a Calvinist bent, believing in double predestination. So it's not just if you're an unbeliever, you go to hell. It's God decided before the creation of the universe, before the creation of any humans, he knew who he was going to create, and he already decided who's going to heaven and who's going to hell.
How did you feel about that?
I thought, nah.
Yeah.
You know,
I thought, nah.
Yeah, at that time, I was still considering myself a Christian and everything, but I couldn't ever accept that. And part of, I guess this was later on because I moved in law school in high school. And then in college, I did religious studies, like I mentioned to you before the show. I think I mentioned that anyway. Majored in religious studies, and we, had a little unit on Protestantism, talked about John Calvin, and he wasn't a good dude. He was not a good person. No. So if you look in the Bible, it says if, people who are truly Christians have faith in God, they embody the fruits of the Spirit, which are love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. There's a song.
Yep.
So, but you don't see that in the life of John Calvin. I mean, he was an apostate from the Catholic Church,
right?
But he also burned heretics at the stake.
Yep.
He had what amounted to a secret police to go spy on people to make sure they were in church on Sundays.
Yeah.
And, in the Bible, if someone doesn't embody the fruits of the Spirit, then they're not, I think it says like they're not a true teacher or prophet or something like that. And so that just kind of strengthened my belief that this guy's teachings can't be accurate.
And if they are, you're not interested in being a part of it.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And, most Christians around the world do not believe in double predestination. So right. That wasn't like the thing that made me leave Christianity. Actually, the thing that made me leave Christianity, I really didn't have any intention on leaving Christianity until I learned about a different religion in my religious studies class. And this is a whole story on its own, obviously, but I ended up converting to that.
Oh, interesting. I didn't know that.
And then when I left that religion, I was like, what do I do now? Well, I didn't go back to Christianity. But it was I would have ended up leaving Christianity anyway without that middle step, but yeah.
Do you feel like it was more like a baby steps? You needed to go from one to like a lesser one in order to feel comfortable leaving it entirely?
Yes, and lesser turned out to not be the case. I thought maybe it was, because the first thing, like I said, that I started, unpacking was I don't believe in hell.
Right.
And then, I started questioning, like, what about people who never believed in Jesus? And I started thinking, well, maybe they had prophets as well, or teachers and things like that. There's not really, in my mind, there wasn't any reason why every single prophet to ever have existed was in Israel. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Or in the Bible, at least, because some of them left Israel. But that's another thing. There were prophets sent from Israel to other lands. Why not prophets from other lands?
And why do you think it's so important? You mentioned this a little bit in your application, but Why do you think it's so important for young Earth creationists to believe that the Earth is young? Why do you think, because you mentioned, your first question was you didn't understand why we couldn't all agree that God created everything first and then it changed after that, why do you think it's so important to them that they die on that hill where the Earth is young? It can't possibly have been created millions of years ago by God. It had to have been 6,000 years, because I feel like they've been saying 6,000 years for so long that at this point we can at least say 6,500 years,
Right. Thing is, I mean, when you say so long that we can say 6,500 years, kind of. Because the thing is that level of biblical literalism is new. It's very recent, and it barely exists outside of the United States.
I feel like it's a uniquely American thing for
It's
sure.
uniquely American, and it is uniquely mid-1800s and forward.
Mm.
But the Protestant churches, from the beginning, there's this idea of getting back to the original church, right? Feeling that the Catholic Church had become corrupted. And that's why you have people because the Protestant Reformation was not unified. You have Martin Luther, John Calvin, a guy named Zwingli, and then all these other people in groups who left the Catholic Church separately, found out about each other, and then started talking. But, point is they all wanted to get back to this original idea of the church, right? So then fast forward to the 1800s in the United States. Well, interestingly enough, you see the same kind of thing with the Mormons trying to get back to the original idea of the church. And around the 1800s, they started to get this idea that the original church interpreted the Bible completely literally, outside of the book of Revelations, the last half of Daniel, and the parables. Everything else is fully literal. I can't tell you why that idea started cropping up, but what I can tell you is that Protestants still today very much want to get back to the original idea of the church, under the assumption that that's what the original church did. They interpreted all these things literally. And the original church did not do that, of course. But I think that for them, it's the idea is that if you're not part of the original church, then you're not really a Christian. And they have the mistaken idea that the early Christians interpreted the Bible fully literally. And so they don't want to let go of that, because in their mind, then that's not true Christianity.
Do you think it's less that system of beliefs is appealing to them and more about they're afraid if they don't stick with that system of beliefs, they're all going to go to hell because they took the easier route?
I think that's part of it, yeah. And I think, it's repeated over and over in churches. I hear this so often that I hear atheists repeat the same thing, that interpreting the Bible symbolically and allegorically is new.
Yes.
And it's just not historically accurate. And so I think that part of it is they're afraid they'll lose their salvation, which is a phrase I heard so much growing up. And I think part of it, honestly, is just general human stubbornness and not wanting to admit that you're wrong, which is a hard thing to do, of course.
Oh, 100%. Like wanting to stick with tradition. I feel like half the reason people want to stick with traditions is because they don't like change. And if they don't stick with the tradition, they're admitting in a sense that they were wrong about how important it always was to do things that way. So they would rather dig their heels in and be like, no, we're never changing anything, than admit, the new way of doing things actually sounds a little bit more appealing, makes a little bit more sense.
Right.
So you had mentioned, and I thought this was also very interesting too, that some of the first things that you had kind of rejected when you were in high school and you first started questioning the reality and the truth behind what you were being told, you mentioned that first you ditched young Earth creationist after the idea of hell. And then you also talked about how you didn't think that being gay was as bad as they made it out to be. And that was before you even realized you yourself were gay. What made you think that? What made you come to that conclusion?
Okay, so what you have to understand is I grew up in an extremely small conservative town. And the first time, let me tell you the story. The first time I ever saw a gay person, knowing they were gay, I was 14.
Wow.
14. And obviously I probably saw plenty of them, but you don't talk about it where I grew up.
Right.
I was 14 and I was on a mission trip with my church, with my youth group. We went to Mexico to build houses. It was a great trip. It was a wonderful trip. There's some really weird parts about it, but mostly I look back on it fondly. But we drove there from Central Oregon, which, again, that's a whole story just by itself.
That's a long drive.
Our last stop was in Arizona. Our last stop in the United States, anyway, was in Arizona. It was probably 1 a.m, because so we could get as much driving done as we could during the day. Excuse me. And then the next day we crossed the border into Mexico. But we stopped at Denny's or IHOP or something, one of those restaurants that's open super late at night. And we walked in, and it was a big group of different youth groups from the area, but we all kind of stuck with our own group. So me and my youth group were walking in, and our youth pastor was ahead of us, and he stopped us, and he turned around and said, "Hey, you guys, I just need to tell you, there's 2 men up here. They're gay, they're a couple, and I need to warn you about this," essentially saying the most loving thing we can do for these people is basically pretend they're not there. We're not going to say anything. We're not going to even look their way. But I looked and realized basically they're people. They're just existing, having their breakfast. The only difference is they're sitting on the same side of the table as each other, right? So that was like really profound for me. Because you hear all kinds of things growing up in a small conservative town in the middle of Central Oregon. And so much of it in that moment was just not true anymore. You know what I mean? And
Did you think they were going to like look like drag queens or like stick out in some way specific?
I don't think you understand. I didn't know what drag queens were yet.
Oh,
like that's the level of that. Yeah. But no, I had no idea. Like that's levels. I had no idea what to expect. And then they were just people. So,
yeah,
it took, after that I thought about it and I thought about it and I thought about it and I thought, why not? Why would God have an issue with that? And I guess at that point I had come to a point where I didn't need to just accept what people told me. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I really think it's possible where people start to actually think for themselves a little bit. And so I looked it up online. I read the Bible, but no matter what I found, I just thought, it doesn't make sense. So I'm not going to bother with it.
That's really cool. That's really cool. And so how did you then later, how old were you when you came to terms or when you started to kind of understand that maybe you were also gay too? Was that slow? Was it kind of like a quick, like, how did that come to be?
Not quick at all. I was in high school and I as people, it's so cliche, I had these feelings that I didn't understand and blah, blah, blah. And I was vaguely familiar with the idea of bisexuality, but like didn't even really fully understand what that meant. Mm-hmm. Because again, that's just how it is growing up where I did. And I was dating a girl in high school, and that's a whole story, of course. But I was so confused. How could I seemingly have this attraction to men, but also attraction to women? And it would be a good decade before I realized I don't have an attraction to women.
Yeah.
But I was so confused until one day I was asleep. One night, I guess I was asleep, and I must have been having a dream or something that I don't remember, because I'm not making this up. I bolted upright in bed from a deep sleep, sat up, thought, oh, I must be bisexual. Lay down and went to sleep, back to sleep, like that. It's like something from an animated sitcom, but it's what happened. I swear. And then I woke up in the morning and I thought, oh dear God, I can't be. And fast forward to college, I went to a very liberal university and ultimately came to just accept it about myself. But I still didn't tell anyone until I left university. I came out to my friends as bisexual. At that point, fully accepted it about myself and everything, told them, and then a few years later realized actually, I'm not just gay. So
interesting. And so what do you think was harder to accept about yourself? Your sexuality or your lack of religion? Which one was the harder one to come to terms with?
That's a good question. I guess I would have to say, well, I don't know. I think they're just so intricately tied up with each other. I don't know that I
Yeah.
could choose one or the other. Because like I said, I left Christianity. I converted to a different religion, also homophobic. But in my mind, through all of it, well, I'm bisexual. I don't have to be with men. I can marry a woman and raise a nice religious family, whatever. Um, and then left that religion, spent a few years kind of doing all kinds of different things and reading and researching, and ultimately ended up in the religion I am now, which is accepting of who I am. But it was in that period, that in between period, that I realized, oh, I'm not attracted to women at all. So I don't think that would have happened unless I had left behind the homophobic religions. So maybe that one was more difficult. I'm not sure, but yeah.
I mean, and it makes sense that they would be super tied up together, especially given the way that you were raised and like the background that you came from and the beliefs that they held towards, the
Yeah.
LGBT community. So would you say that you are still religious, you're just not still
Yes.
a Christian, or are you spiritual and
Yeah.
not religious?
Yeah, I'm Buddhist. So
Buddhist. Okay.
yeah, and Buddhism can be a bit of a mixed bag. Most because in Buddhism there's like schools of Buddhism, right, as opposed to denominations of Christianity. Most, like vast majority of schools of Buddhism do not take a stand one way or the other. The school of Buddhism I follow is originally from Japan. It exists mostly in Japan and the United States. And the only reason it really exists in the United States at all is because of immigration, but has become more diverse and all sorts of people have become followers of it. But there's, the question arises all the time of, is it okay to be gay? Are we going to perform gay weddings and things like that? And I love the answer that is given every time. It's fascinating. It's a bit sad, but it's good, because what everyone points back to is World War II, when all the Japanese people, including the Japanese Buddhists, were rounded up and put into internment camps, stripped of their rights and their property. The temple that I go to was closed down, of course, when most all the members were taken to the internment camps. There were 2 white American members at the time. They stayed behind to watch the temple, and all the members put all their belongings in the temple for safekeeping because they couldn't keep their houses.
Wow.
And so the answer people give is that, we, Japanese Americans, so that's not the answer I give, obviously, but people say we were stripped of our rights, taken from our homes. Why would we ever want anyone else to be stripped of their rights as well? And that's the answer that is given. And so the school of Buddhism I follow is called Jodo Shinshu. And the first gay wedding at a Jodo Shinshu temple that we know of was in the mid-70s, which is far sooner than was legally recognized, far sooner than most places of worship did these weddings. There is some pretty good evidence, even though it wasn't documented, there's some pretty good evidence that they've been going back since the 1950s.
Wow.
I just think that's really cool, that kind of solidarity.
Absolutely.
Even though
that is really
it
cool.
both kind of comes from a place of, having your rights taken away. I love that coming together. So
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that stance where they're like, look, we know what it's like to lose our rights. We know what it's like to be judged, to be illegal just by existing.
Right.
Why would we ever want to treat somebody else like they're illegal to exist? And I love that story where there were people that were protecting their items in the temple. Which is like, it's a terrible story. It's a sad story, but it's like it's a wonderful spin on a terrible story.
Right.
And so what have you found that was the most attractive about Buddhism to you? Was it the acceptance of the LGBTQ community, or was it the peace? Like, what is it about them as a non-Abrahamic religion that you found so interesting?
Yeah. So it's going to take a little bit of explanation on like the beliefs of Buddhism and the particular school of Buddhism that I follow. In Buddhism, the goal is to reach enlightenment, reach nirvana, as opposed to continuing the cycle of reincarnation. Well, every school of Buddhism pretty much has a different way of doing that, and they're usually all recognized as perfectly legitimate. It said that the Buddha gave 84,000 different paths to enlightenment. That number is symbolic, of course, but all those paths are perfectly legitimate. It just depends on the individual person and which way works best for them from their past karma. Right. So Jodo Shinshu is a school of Pure Land Buddhism. And so Pure Land Buddhism is, has its own way to enlightenment. And by the way, when you reach enlightenment, you become a Buddha. It's not like there's just one Buddha. Everyone can become a Buddha. And it's actually taught that everyone will eventually become a Buddha, given us, enough lifetimes. Yeah.
Interesting.
Which, of course I like that because then there's no eternal hell. Of course.
Right, exactly.
There is a Buddha named Amida Buddha who, oh God, I'm sorry. This is also complicated. And I'm trying not to go into too much detail here, but it said that every Buddha, upon reaching enlightenment and becoming a Buddha, manifests a Pure Land around them. And this Pure Land is a place you can be reborn in. So the Pure Land of Amida Buddha is said to be perfect for attaining enlightenment. It's said that if you are reincarnated there, then by the end of that lifetime, you will have reached enlightenment and you will become a Buddha. So in Pure Land Buddhism, the idea is to go to the Pure Land of Amida Buddha in your next life. And it is said that Amida Buddha accepts everyone into his Pure Land, no matter what. In fact, all you have to do is say the name of the Buddha. And anyone, the way it's often listed is it says anyone, young or old, male or female, educated or not educated, can be reborn in the Pure Land. And it also says that you are accepted into the Pure Land exactly as you are right now. And, growing up in church, I'd always hear, come just as you are, hear the Spirit call, come and believe, come and receive, come and live forever.
Unless you belong to one of these types of people,
Exactly.
then please don't come as you are. Please change a little bit.
I know. I had a guy come to my door once from a local Baptist church. And I was like, okay, whatever, I'll take your little card that you have. And I ended up going on his website because I was curious. That's who I am as a person. And it literally listed groups of people who are not allowed in the church. And one of them was gay people.
What?
Yeah, some of them were like, don't come in if you're high on cocaine. And like, I can kind of get on board with that one.
I don't know. That sounds like a good time, honestly. Some of those hymns would slap, I'm telling you.
Fair enough. But but I just thought, at the end of the day, I mean, I'm kind of joking about the cocaine thing too, because at the end of the day, church is supposed to be a place where you go to change and become better, right? Mm-hmm. And that by itself is not a bad thing. But the problem is, this was my experience growing up, and obviously this isn't going to be true for every Christian. But we're taught, come as you are, be saved as you are. But then now you have to do all this work to change yourself. And if you don't, you're at risk of losing your salvation. Or for the Calvinists, you never had salvation in the first place, because if it's predestination, you can't lose your salvation.
Right. And when a place that's supposed to accept everyone for who they are and says, come as you are, no matter what, yada, 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 still has a list of people who are too bad off to come as they are. Right. Like, you need to fix yourself before you're even allowed to. That's messed up. That's like, you either come as you are or you don't.
Exactly. And I've never seen that anywhere else but this one local Baptist church. So it's, but it blew my mind. Absolutely. At any rate, in Jodo Shinshu, the school of Buddhism I follow, there are teachings of things that we do, right, after we have, how do I explain it? Because salvation isn't like a word that's used, but we talk about our birth in the Pure Land is ensured. It is going to happen, no matter what. And actually nothing at all ever can change that. It's not like you can lose your salvation, right? But there, of course, are teachings of what we do after that. Otherwise, what's the point of being in the religion if you just sit back and, okay, now I do nothing? And part of that is, we want to be more compassionate people, caring and everything. But it's also recognized that we're going to do terrible things because we're unenlightened beings. And nothing ever can change the fact that in the next life you will be born in the Pure Land.
So what is to keep people who... Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. What's to keep people who do bad things like harm other people or like kill or steal? What's to keep them from getting to the exact same plane of like peace and happiness and perfection than people who have achieved, selfless acts and things like that? Or
Right,
is the
right.
idea that everybody is welcome?
The idea is that everybody is welcome. Absolutely. Here's the thing, though. It's, in Buddhism, we believe in karma.
Mm.
And in order to, even so much as hear the Buddhist teachings, you have to have good karma. In order to accept the teachings as true, you have to have even better karma, right? So there's this idea of the Buddha constantly working in the world to try and bring us to that place, because Buddhas are not all powerful. There's no concept of an all powerful deity in Buddhism. So it's not like the Buddha can just like, whoop, you're in the Pure Land now. But right, but the Buddha is constantly manifesting in the world around us to bring us to that place. And so, because that's, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like you're hearkening back to a similar question in Christianity, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's not like how God would just pluck you out and put you in heaven, essentially.
Right.
But the other side of that is, I suppose, once your birth in the Pure Land is ensured, how are you going to, like, what's your motivation to do good things, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, two things to say. One thing, and I'm going to say pretty much the exact same thing as I said about the Calvinists, but that's fine, I guess, is if you're going to go around doing bad things because your birth in the Pure Land is already assured, you're probably not really entrusting yourself to the Buddha, right?
Right. You're probably not a very good Buddhist to begin with, or like interested in Buddhism that much.
Yeah. But the other side of that is we're taught to live a life of gratitude, not only toward the Buddha, but I said that the Buddha is constantly manifesting in the world to bring us to the place where we can, hear the teachings and accept the teachings and be born in the Pure Land. The fancy Buddhist term for that is causes and conditions, right? Because of karma, everything is interconnected. So there's these causes and conditions that happen throughout all your past lives to bring you to exactly where you're at today. So we're not only grateful to the Buddha, but we're grateful to our causes and conditions, right? So I was raised comfortably by my mom mostly, and because of that, those comfortable conditions, I was able to study well and go to college. And it was in college in my religious studies that I first learned about Buddhism, really. And so even though it wasn't my mom's intention, I can still be grateful to her for those causes and conditions that led me to become a Buddhist. And once you start to really think about it, you realize how much actually goes into that. And if you want to live a life of gratitude for those things, you're not going to go around killing and stealing and all these things.
Yeah.
So I guess the idea is we're not in it for the reward as much as far as, doing good things. We're not in it for the reward. We just want to pay back the massive amounts of good things that have been given to us in this life and in past lives.
Interesting. And so how has Buddhism impacted you personally in a positive manner? Like, what was it about Buddhism, or what has it been about Buddhism that's made you want to stick with it long term and be like, this is really good for me?
Yeah, a lot of things.
Mm-hmm.
But I think there's one thing that really illustrates it very well. When so I never finished my degree in college. I hope to finish up the last few classes I need, but I had a complete mental breakdown.
Oh no.
Yeah. And ultimately was diagnosed with schizophrenia. Now, years later, that diagnosis would be lifted because out of the blue, the symptoms are gone. And the doctors don't know why. It's a whole thing. But yeah, and that can happen. It's extremely rare. More common is for people to have those symptoms from some other cause, and then it goes away. Like it was never schizophrenia in the first place. But the point is, I was in a very bad place due to mental illness. And I spent some time not really following religion much at all. And then I was like, I gotta do something. I'm just not content to not follow some spiritual path. And so I was looking into all these things, including a lot of different schools of Buddhism, talking to a lot of local priests and monks in local Buddhist temples. And this seems so silly, looking back on it, because I would always ask all of them that I talked to, I'd say, I have schizophrenia. Again, turns out that would be lifted later. But I would ask, is this like a result of some negative karma from my past? And it's silly because at the time I really thought of it like a test. Like I just wanted these people to give me a straight answer of, yeah, it kind of has to be. And a few people danced around the question. A few people said yes. That was the implication. The Jodo Shinshu priest gave me an answer I never expected. But quite literally, this one email changed my whole life, because he started with the same stock answer that they always give, and I thought, here we go again, because he said that only a fully enlightened Buddha knows exactly what, this fancy Buddhist terms, but exactly what karmic actions lead to which karmic outcomes. Basically saying only a Buddha could really know. And again, I thought, okay, here we go. But then he continued on. He said, but maybe it is. Maybe, essentially what he said was, maybe you did something terrible in a past life and this is the negative karma. Or maybe it's actually the result of some very good karma in your past. Because if your mental illness is what leads you down the path of Buddhism toward enlightenment, then it is necessarily the highest good karma. And I cried. I'm not even joking. Because it took some time to really like let it settle in and everything. But I realized he was kind of right. And if I can see something as terrible as that as a good thing, I realized that changing of perspectives is so much more powerful than I ever knew it could be. And so many things now that normally I think of as terrible things, I can find something good in it. And eventually you realize that little good thing is actually a really big good thing. You know what I mean?
Yeah. It seems small at the time, but in the big scheme of things, it's huge.
Yeah. And it really illustrates a very common, though hard to understand, Buddhist teaching. Because I said that the idea is to reach nirvana, right? This world of enlightenment. And what we're living in is samsara, the cycle of birth and death, and like a world of suffering, really. But the teaching in Buddhism is that samsara is nirvana. But the idea is that we don't see it the right way. It's that shifting of perspectives. And because when he told me that, I wasn't sure I wanted to be Buddhist yet.
Yeah.
But the more I thought of it is like, if I can shift my perspective on something like schizophrenia like that, then I think that shifting perspectives really is profound enough that it kind of makes sense that samsara is nirvana.
So it's almost like you can take what you're currently in and the life that you're currently given and turn that into your own perfect place and like perfect being, depending on where your perspective is.
Yeah, and I'm not saying I'm always good at that.
No.
But that's what I've been learning to do, and it is insanely profound, and my life has improved so much since then.
Do you feel like you treat other people a lot differently since you've been looking at it from that perspective?
Oh yeah. Another teaching in Buddhism also is, so I think people kind of think of it like once you reach enlightenment, you're just like there, like there's a threshold, but there's like levels to enlightenment where you kind of work your way up to the full enlightenment of a Buddha. And there's beings called bodhisattvas who are enlightened beings, but who are not fully enlightened Buddhas yet. In fact, they choose not to. They choose to stay in the cycle of reincarnation to lead others to enlightenment. And we're taught to view everyone else as a bodhisattva. And, according to Buddhist beliefs, or Buddhist teachings, I guess, they might be or they might not be. But if you treat everyone like a bodhisattva, who is here for you specifically, to help you specifically reach enlightenment, you start to be a lot kinder to people, a lot more understanding. And again, that's really hard to do a lot of the times. But very early on, I learned the power of shifting your perspective. And it's helped me to do that also. So yes, absolutely, it made me kinder to other people.
That's amazing. And how has your relationship with your immediate family or your extended family changed since you've become Buddhist, since you've come out, if you're out to them sexually? Like, how has that changed? Do you find that they're patient with you? Have you had to cut contact with people?
Well, I haven't cut contact with anyone, but that's because the only person, for completely unrelated reasons, the only person I still have any regular contact with in my family is my mom. Family dynamics are complicated, but they're far more complicated in my family than most, and I'm not just saying that, I promise. I don't really talk about religion with my mom. I was outed to my mom. Whole story again.
Yeah.
But I don't want to sound mean. I'm not trying to be mean when I say this or anything. It's just a fact that she ignores these kind of things, and we haven't talked about it since. Because when it first happened, I was like, I'm just going to give it some time. I'll wait for her to come to me to talk about this when she's ready. Years later, she never did. And that's just kind of where we're at now. And so, yeah. So really, I guess really hasn't changed much. So.
Yeah, that's good. I feel like that's actually a very common response from people who don't agree with something, but they also aren't a confrontational person, is they just pretend like it never happened and never talk about it again. And you're just like, I really want to talk about this, but you clearly don't. But I feel like this is a conversation we need to have, but you clearly don't. And so there's almost a point where at first you're kind of like pissed about it because you really want to talk to them about it, and then one day you just realize it's never going to happen. It's not.
It's never going to happen. And at the end of the day, it's a much better situation than it could be.
Yeah.
Even if it's not as good as it could be. So, yeah.
Absolutely, 100%. And I feel like Buddhism would be one of those things that makes you more patient in that regard as well. Where before maybe you had different feelings about that scenario, now with the Buddhist teachings and the things that it's almost like a meditative response. You're like, you know what? I'm just going to let them exist in the peace that they need to exist in, regardless of how I feel about it.
And we're taught, a lot about suffering in Buddhism. And so there's a whole issue of suffering really being a bad translation of the original word, because it runs the whole spectrum from deep suffering to like the most mild inconvenience. But you start to realize that almost always, the bad things that people do are a result of their own suffering.
Yes.
And so, like, going back to what we were talking about earlier, how people kind of criticize Christianity for, even the worst people go to hell, but the best people, if they just didn't believe, the worst people can go to heaven, but the best people, even if only because they don't believe, then they go to hell, right? That's a very valid criticism. But I think people kind of look at Buddhism, especially Pure Land, kind of the same way, where even the worst people can reach enlightenment. Well, sure, maybe they don't deserve enlightenment, neither do I. I don't think anyone really does. But even saying they don't deserve enlightenment is a Western mindset, because in Buddhism, what you deserve or do not deserve is completely irrelevant. Karma has nothing to do with what you deserve. It's the natural consequences of your actions. At any rate, sure, they may not deserve enlightenment. They don't care. It's going to have a net positive on the whole world. So I don't care what people deserve. I care about people reaching enlightenment and ending their suffering.
Yeah, it's
and
almost
like they do that or not, they will stop causing suffering to other people too.
Right.
Because it's all connected. Right. So yeah.
And I almost feel like it's like whatever happens to everybody else is none of my business. What happens to me is my business, and I hope that things get better for everybody else. But who makes it where because of what? Not my business. Whereas I feel like in Christianity, it's everybody's business. Like who makes it, who doesn't, who's a good enough Christian, who's not. Like being everybody else's business is like the whole point.
No, I agree. And you make me think of a quote from the founder of Jodo Shinshu. He talked about the Pure Land Buddhism as the easy path, because all that's required is you say the name of the Buddha and you're born in the Pure Land and you're enlightened. And he referred to other schools of Buddhism as the difficult path, because you have to do all these things like meditation and chanting the sutras and reciting mantras and all these things. And he talks about compassion within these two paths. He says compassion in the path of sages is to like essentially teach people Buddhism and get them to do the practices and help them reach enlightenment. Whereas the compassion in the Pure Land path is for me to reach enlightenment, for me to become a Buddha, because it said that when you're a Buddha, you can do that effectively. You can help people reach enlightenment effectively and perfectly because you're perfectly enlightened. I can't do that. You know what I mean? Like if I try and for that reason, I actually don't talk about my religion all that often. I'm seeing someone right now, and we were together for like 4 months, and I realized I've never told this guy that I'm Buddhist because I just don't talk about it because I don't want people to think I'm trying to push my religion on them. I'm trying to get them to join it because I'm not an enlightened being who can effectively teach them. All I want to do is do my practices, go to the Pure Land, and after that, I can do it and actually be effective at it, right?
Yeah.
Whereas in Christianity, it was, you need to tell your friends about Jesus. Now, pick up your phone and call them. Now. And that's not an exaggeration. I've experienced exactly that.
Yes.
And in that, you know, other religions I was part of after Christianity, very similar thing. You need to tell people right now. And it's just not, first of all, people don't like that.
Yeah.
Second of all, that's not exactly spiritually fulfilling for me.
No.
So what's the point? I mean, oftentimes the point is money. But
yeah.
No, what's the point totally. Of being part of that? You know what I mean? So.
Like, we know what the point is. Come on. We know what the point. But like, also there's that angle that I feel like a lot of Christian denominations push where it's almost, it's not outright said, but it's almost your fault if certain people don't make it to church and make it to heaven. Oh, yeah. It's like, not only is it, let's proselytize and tell everyone about Jesus, but it's, if they don't come and they're not part of Jesus and they're not part of the church, like, you probably didn't do a very good job, or you're not working hard enough in the name of God or the name of Jesus. Right. And so there's like, not only is there that proselytization that most people on the outside don't like, but then there's that guilt on the inside where it's like an MLM where you're not allowed to not bug people about your products. Yeah. You know what I mean? Yeah. Like, you know, they don't want to hear about it. Exactly. Like, you know, they don't want to hear about it. They know they don't want to hear about it, but you were literally told, like, they will go to hell if you don't tell them about it. Like, just keep telling them about it. And so it's like a double-edged sword.
Mm-hmm. That reminds me of a video that I was shown in youth group in church growing up. That's always stuck with me because, I mean, even at the time I was like, this is ludicrous, you guys. But this is the story. There's this, these 4 friends are driving. Well, one is driving, but they're all 4 like in the car together, and they get hit by a truck or something, and they all die immediately. Jeez. Which, first of all, do I have to say more? That's just already insane. But the story goes, you know, it's showing them in the afterlife or whatever, and first they're just still sitting in the car as souls or whatever, I don't know. But one of the guys, he starts saying, like, I wish I had more time, and no one's sure what he means. Well, it turns out he said he thought he had more time to tell them about Jesus, right? And he's feeling guilty. He didn't tell his friends about Jesus, and now they're dead. And then it briefly shows that guy going to heaven, and then there's a whole long sequence of the other 3 kids being thrown into hell. And hell was shown as like a prison with red lights over everything, naturally, because why not? But they're like thrown into these prison cells and locked up, and they're there forever. And it's like, I'm so glad that even back, because I was probably middle school, and I'm so glad that even back then I had the wherewithal to think, no, this is insane, and I'm not going to let this dictate in my life or my actions. So
yeah. And the number of people that weren't able to have that cognitive moment and instead watched that and thought, this is the most terrifying thing I've ever seen, I don't want this to happen to me, is like, you hope that everybody secretly has the same thoughts like that, and they just don't admit it to anybody, like oh, that's not real, there's no way it's that bad. But you know that there's got to be people, especially over the, you know, the years that this has been going on, especially like evangelical Christianity in America, that are just terrified. Like, I was reading an article about rapture terror and like rapture anxiety, and how many people have that. And you're just like, this is real to some people. This is so real. And I'm just glad that you were able to sit back and be like, no, not my thing. Don't believe it.
Yeah. But well, that reminds me now. Sorry.
No, continue.
Reminds me now you're sending me back to grade school, where for whatever reason, I mean, I was in like 2nd or 3rd grade, so who knows what goes on in kids' minds. But I got it in my head that the rapture was going to happen by the end of that week. And I started like telling everyone I know, like, prepare yourself, the rapture is happening this week.
Yep.
And then there's, of course, the whole no one knows the day or the hour except for the Father in heaven. And I thought to myself, well, I don't know the day or the hour. I just know the week.
Yeah,
So,
that's hilarious.
but yeah, and the rapture. And then I appreciated my youth pastor in high school also, who told us that the rapture, there's no precedence for it in the Bible. And again, that those beliefs only started in America in the 1800s also. So I could put that to rest easy enough.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you had people in your life that were like, "Hey, by the way, a little more information about this. Maybe it's not literal after all,
Right.
and they gave you kind of that peace of mind, even though
Mm-hmm.
in the big picture that probably wasn't a lot of peace of mind. It's at least a little bit that can help you kind of figure out your deconstruction process or figure
Yep.
out what it is you want to believe and what you don't
Mm-hmm.
want to believe. Um, well, Dean, this has been a really great conversation, and I feel like I've learned even more about you. Even though your submission was so detailed, I learned even more about you.
Yeah.
I feel like talking to you.
Yeah.
If there was anybody listening to this who maybe they are going through something similar where they're not sure they want to follow their church, maybe they are thinking like their sexuality leans differently than they thought it did, they're not quite sure where to go from here, what would you suggest to them? What would your advice be?
Just keep going, because there was a time when I considered stopping. And what that means exactly to just stop, I don't even really know. But for years and years and years after leaving Christianity, I would wake up in a cold sweat, terrified of going to hell.
Yeah.
But eventually it goes away. It really does. And I found the thing that helped it go away for me. That was Buddhism. That's not going to work for everyone, obviously, but you will find that thing. It will work, and your life will be better for it. I promise. So I guess
Don't give up.
but seriously, don't give up. Yeah, yeah,
Explore all options.
absolutely. Yeah.
Well, Dean, thank you so much for your time and your
Thank you.
story, and your background. I feel like the number of times that I know there could have been like a whole other like offshoot story because
Right.
you've been through so many things, and you've experienced so many things, makes me very curious.
Mhm.
But yeah, I hope that when people listen to this, they see themselves a little bit in your story, and it helps them understand that there is, there's life after confusion. There's life after religion, whether it's
Mhm.
Christianity, whether it's a different religion,
Right.
and that they have options. They have
Right.
options. They should explore them. Who are they? What do they truly believe? Do your research, right? Just because
Mhm.
somebody says something is correct doesn't necessarily mean you have to go with that version. Um, and that at the end of the day, there is that option to be whoever they want to be, however it
Mhm.
is they have to get there. And I think you're a great example of that. You're just out here, you're living your best life, you're trying to figure out, like, I like that you explained it as you're not there yet. Like, there's always more
Mhm.
to learn, there's always more to kind of explore. So thank you for that. Thank you for giving
Of
people that
course.
peace of
Yeah.
mind.
Yep.